Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, April 12th, 2023. And the founders and old revolutionaries understood, because of human nature, that government power is like a cancer, a deadly disease. And so today I've got some warnings from them about that disease and a little bit on how people are supposed to deal with it. How do you deal with a cancer? Do you let it grow and grow and grow, or do you do something else about it? And then I'm going to close out with three big areas where I believe the people have spectacularly failed to get the job done. Just absolutely miserably failed to get the job done that they were supposed to have been done all along. But let's get right to it. First, starting out with a great quote from John Adams back from when he was one of the good guys writing as Novanglis in his third paper in 1775. He pointed out that the nature of encroachment upon the American Constitution, of course, American Constitution, not the Constitution for the United States of today, but the unwritten one that they had gone through, and of course, well, I'm getting sidetracked there. The nature of encroachment upon the American Constitution is such as to grow every day more and more encroaching. Like a cancer, it eats faster and faster every hour. So as soon as the people allow government to take a step beyond the limits that are authorized to the government, well, it creates a precedent for more and more and more. And John Adams and many others saw this as like a deadly disease. And even years later, here, for example, Governor Morris, in support of the secession movement of northeastern states, again, in response to the War of 1812. I might do an episode on that at some point. I'm definitely no expert on that point in time and on that issue, but I think it's really interesting stuff. But here's how Governor Morris put it. For as a cancer shoots deep before the skin is discolored, so there are diseases in the political body which become mortal before they are evident to cursory observation. Again, the same mentality a few decades later, that when there are really bad political problems, it is a deadly, deadly disease, deadly to liberty, and of course, deadly to many lives as well. And much earlier, here's John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, in his famous Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. He closed off each of them with a various little quick quote. One of them is on our membership cards, Concordia res parve crescunt. It means small things grow great by concord. It's a strategic advice. And here also another strategic piece of advice, closing out letter number 9. My Latin is so bad. Venienti accurate morbo, which means oppose a disease at its beginning. And this is really based on their understanding of human nature. They saw precedent, even the smallest thing, as something that could be built upon and almost always would be, because people who hold power and, well, the corrupting nature of humanity means that once they have a little bit of power, they're going to use that as a baseline, not as a limit, and they're going to keep building upon that. Here, for example, Patrick Henry said, this is one of his big arguments against ratification during the Virginia ratification debates in summer of 1788. He said, if you have a good president, senator, and representatives, there is no danger. So based on what's being set up here, as long as you get the right people in office, everything's going to be great. But can this be expected from human nature? Unfortunately, most people lean towards the former view. Just get the right people there, everything will be great. But decade in and decade out, the right people are not there. And we should have more closely paid attention to some of these warnings from Patrick Henry and others. You can't count on them because of human nature. Here's William, in French, I guess it's Lenoir, but I'm assuming in North Carolina and elsewhere it's Lenore. William Lenore, it is natural for men to aspire to power. It is the nature of mankind to be tyrannical. Or in the great pun of all ages, Samuel Adams, power is intoxicating, and men legally vested with it too often discover a disposition to make an ill use of it and an unwillingness to part of it. So even if you give them the power for a good reason, they're going to find, because of that intoxicating nature of power and, of course, of human nature, people will generally try to use that power for stuff that they weren't authorized to use it for in the first place, and they never want to give it back. And because of this corrupt nature of humanity and this view of power being intoxicating, we should all know that when people get in power, they're going to try to increase it. That's exactly what George Mason had to say. He said, those who have power in their hands will not give it up while they can retain it. On the contrary, we know they will always, when they can, rather increase it. And there's a lot to unpack there, but really I think the key point is recognizing the problems with power, the problems with human nature, but then on top of it, it's not just sometimes they're going to try to increase the power. It's not once in a while. It's not only just the bad guys, even the good guys this is going to happen with. And we can see this happen to many in the founding generation as well once they got power. John Adams, for example, who Mercy Otis Warren in her great history of the American Revolution pointed out, this is the Atlas of Independence, one of the leading voices of liberty in the run-up to the War for Independence. And then once he got into office and power, you get things like the Alien and Sedition Act. So this is really a lesson that you shouldn't trust people with power, especially or including the people who tell you don't trust people with power because it is so corrupting. And that's what George Mason is talking about here. It's not just some people who will try to increase it, but they will always, when they can, increase it. And when they can really gets down to whether they can get away with it or not. And that's really what it gets down to. St. George Tucker, in his view of the Constitution of the United States, said all governments have a natural tendency towards an increase. All governments, not some, not a few, not most, not just the ones over there, not just the ones other than us, not just the bad guys. All governments have a natural tendency towards an increase and an assumption of power. And if we think about that in comparison to what the founders, even the Federalists, the big government people of the time, told us would be a government of few and defined powers, and everything else would be reserved to the states or the people. And now it's turned into the largest government in history. This should be absolute proof that this was something to pay attention to. Abigail Adams put it this way: power, whether vested in many or a few, is ever grasping, always, relentless, constantly. And recognizing all this, there is only one way to deal with government power. I'm going to get to that in just a moment. I should mention that I'm going to link to, I'm going to do my best to get as many of these original source documents linked to in my blog post for this episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. I'll get that published about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done here. And there you're going to find a show notes section. So when you're like, Bolden, where did you find that quote or that article or that episode you mentioned, which I've got a few later on? Where are you going to find that? It's going to be in the blog post for this episode. I publish one for every single episode. You can also find all the different platforms we're on, both video, the live streaming platforms like YouTube and Facebook, and Twitch and Twitter and LinkedIn. We also live stream on Rumble, which has been pretty cool lately, and same with Odyssey. I like both those platforms. And we archive as many places as possible, and we also have audio-only podcast editions all over the place: Apple, Spotify, iHeart, TuneIn, and the rest. And I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while I'm taking this quick break. It's not a commercial break, but it's a quick hello. Well, I appreciate you guys being here. There's Alt Reality, Haji in Michigan, Kirk Morrison, South Carolina, Prince Dylan in Mississippi, Isabel, President Merkin Muffley, Natural Law in Iowa, Joseph Bonamolo, and everyone else. I appreciate you guys being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. And I know I've probably skipped over a few people, but I'll look a little bit later today or tomorrow and read through the comments, whether it's live or in the archive. I've got tons of great ideas for future episodes from your feedback. Sometimes it's questions. Sometimes it's someone saying, oh, dude, you made a mistake on this, or can you prove this? And then I do a follow-up. So I really appreciate your feedback. And of course, it helps trigger the algorithms of the mainstream platforms and tells them to show us to more people. So thank you so much. So anyways, recognizing this problem of power, this maxim of human nature, always aspiring to be tyrannical when it has a chance. The only way to deal with government and to deal with a disease is to cut it out when you got a problem. And that's how Adams put it in that same Novanglis letter in 1775. Obsta principiis, that's the Latin phrase, which is nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud. He said this is the only maxim, not just a good idea, not just maybe something to think about later on, but it is the only maxim which can ever preserve the liberties of any people. So if you don't nip the shoots of arbitrary power is one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence. It's power that's not authorized. So if government is only authorized to do a certain number of things, as soon as they just start making stuff up or they treat it as a living, breathing constitution, for example, all those exercises of power beyond the just limits in the Constitution itself, those are acts of arbitrary power. They're just based on the whim of people who hold the guns, I guess. But the only way to deal with that is to nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud. That's the only way you can preserve liberty. And when you don't, you end up with, well, the largest government in history, and it becomes much more difficult to turn things around. He said, when the people give way, their deceivers, betrayers, and destroyers press upon them so fast that there is no resisting afterwards. Well, he was a little bit more, I'm pretty cynical, and maybe he was even more cynical than I am, but that's a really powerful way to put it. When the people give way, their deceivers, betrayers, and destroyers press upon them so quickly, like a cancer. And that's the exact same thing that James Otis Jr., and this is not Adams or Otis or anyone making up this principle. This is widely understood through their education, through their understanding of human history. But here's how James Otis put it in Freeborn American in 1767, writing as Freeborn American. He said, "It is, my countrymen, of the utmost consequence that we boldly oppose the least infraction of our charter and our rights as men." Boldly oppose the least infraction. And Thomas Jefferson, I'll get to him in just a moment, or in a little bit, talking about how, well, if you let it go on, if you let it fester, you're going to have a big problem. And in his arguments against Hamilton's First National Bank in 1791, he said to take a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution is to take a boundless field of power. And that's why Otis is saying, look, and not because of Jefferson, but the understanding, this widely understood principle that once you give government the precedent to do bad stuff, it will continue to do more, more and more and more. So we have to boldly oppose the least infraction of our charter. He said, obsta principiis is a maxim never to be forgot. If we do not resist at the first attack, it may soon be too late. And here's and that's why I'm not Thomas Jefferson yet. John Dickinson, again, in those letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, that's what he said a free people has to do. If you're a free people, you can never be too quick in observing nor too firm in opposing the beginnings of alteration. So you can't be too quick to be like, they're doing something they're not supposed to do. And you can't be too firm in trying to put an end to it because you cannot let them gain hold. And of course, well, they have definitely gained hold, and I'm going to get to a few of the worst ways they've done that here in just a moment. Here's how Thomas Jefferson put it in his notes on the state of Virginia, 1785, I think this was published. He said, human nature, again, Jefferson recognizing human nature. Human nature is the same on every side of the Atlantic, because some were just arguing, well, we've got the way we're setting things up here in Virginia, well, it's different. We're not those European states. We're not from other parts of the world where they have problems, but he's recognizing it's not just the structure of how you set up a government. You can't just put words on paper and just say, well, they're going to follow this. Human nature has to be taken into account. And when you give them the power to do something good, you're also giving them the power to do something bad with that power. That's not what Jefferson said. John Jay specifically said that. But here he is. Human nature is the same on every side of the Atlantic and will be alike influenced by the same causes. The time to guard against corruption and tyranny is before they shall have gotten hold of us. It is better to keep the wolf out of the fold than to trust drawing his teeth and talons after he shall have entered. So, not like a deadly disease, but recognizing human nature and government as a wolf ready to devour you, to eat you alive, to kill you, to destroy you. And whether they're doing that metaphorically by taking your liberty and reducing your humanity, because when you don't have freedom, they're taking away part of your human nature by doing that. And when the people actually go along with it, well, that's pretty bad. But ultimately, it's to the founding generation, to the old revolutionaries. It's really up to the people to protect and defend their own constitution and their own liberty, whether the government happens to like it or not. I've done a bunch of episodes covering that type of a principle. One of my favorites I will link to in the show notes today is one from January of last year, 2022. Who is supposed to keep the feds in check. And the overview, I think, is good to read. It's definitely not about somehow magically getting to the feds to limit their own power. As John Dickinson put it, now we could call him, he was known as the penman of the American Revolution. We could call him the father of the Articles of Confederation with a few others. But he was also in support of the Constitution a few years later. And he was writing, like, look, it doesn't matter how good of a Constitution we get here. Ultimately, you're going to find an administration that does bad stuff. So we're going to do our best to try to make it as difficult for them with the words on paper, but words on paper don't enforce themselves. So he said it must be granted that a bad administration may take place. We certainly have a very bad administration, year in and year out, administration in and administration out, or we wouldn't live under the largest government in history. We wouldn't have mass warrantless surveillance. We wouldn't have restrictions on our right to keep and bear arms. We wouldn't have the insane economic policies that are going on, the debt, the spending, the printing. None of that would actually be happening. So, but what is to be done? And Dickinson said, ultimately, it's up to the supreme sovereignty of the people. It is their duty, he said, to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved, or in the Roman phrase, on perilous occasions, I'm just going from the top of my head, to provide that the Republic receive no damage. So ultimately, the Constitution is not enforced by the Constitution, because that can't do it. The Constitution, the limits on federal power aren't enforced by the federal government, because that's absurd. To rely on one branch or another of the federal government to limit itself, or all of them to limit itself. Of course, the checks and balances idea is important because you can create a little bit of gridlock, but ultimately when they're all doing the wrong stuff, the real check and balance comes from the people of the several states. The people and the states, or if the states suck, which they also do, it's the people themselves. So ultimately it is up to the supreme sovereignty of the people to keep the feds in check. And I wanted to go over 3 ways that I think the people have absolutely miserably failed to keep the wolf out of the fold, taking that analogy from Thomas Jefferson. First of all, the national bank. And arguing, as I mentioned before, against that first national bank, Jefferson warned that taking a single step, one step beyond the limits of the Constitution is a step too far. He said it is the same as taking a boundless field of power. And when Dickinson years earlier was talking about oppose a disease at its beginning, he was recognizing that when you have a concession that creates a precedent, like, oh, okay, we're scared of this is dangerous, this is some emergency, let's allow them to do this extra thing for this one reason. The moment you do that, that's when your freedom is lost, not later on when they use that power directly against you. It's because they're no longer limited. And that's what Jefferson was saying in his response to Hamilton's First National Bank. Unfortunately, he lost that. But here is how Mike Meharry put it in a great article from a couple of years ago, how the national bank destroyed the limits of the Constitution. And even though that first bank, Hamilton's bank, isn't around today, we have the second bank, which was also bad, and then we had the Federal Reserve. But it's the precedent, the constitutional arguments that were established that created the foundation for this. The idea that the word necessary didn't actually mean necessary, for example. The word necessary suddenly meant convenient, as long as it was convenient to government power. And if you take that approach, and that's what Hamilton said, that's what John Marshall said some years later, almost word for word citing parts of Hamilton's argument. If you take that view that necessary really means convenient, there isn't a single power on earth that the government isn't going to claim is for their convenience. So that's a really, really dangerous thing. And so today, based on the same understanding, we now have the Federal Reserve, which Mike says is the engine that drives the biggest, most powerful government in the history of the world. We can trace the origins of this modern central bank back to the creation of the first bank of the U.S., even before ratification of the Bill of Rights. And this is a pretty good piece here. He said, Hamilton's arguments, and of course, I will link to this article in the show notes. I hope you'll check it out. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. Mike says, Hamilton's arguments for the bank became the basis for loose constitutional construction, the one that flipped the structure of the U.S. government on its head. Instead of a federal government exercising powers few and defined, like I mentioned before, that's James Madison Federalist number 45, Hamiltonian constitutionalism gave us a central government with powers numerous and indefinite, or just powers convenient to whatever power they think is necessary to continue exercising more power. So the number one way, I think, and this isn't really in any order, and these top three could probably change based on the day, but I think establishing that bank and creating the precedent for what we have today, the Federal Reserve System, is giving them the power to do everything. Because if they couldn't run the money printer today, they wouldn't be able to fund all these programs through direct taxation. They can only get away with it through that sneaky inflation tax. They can't get you to give them an extra $50,000, but they can cut out $50,000 of your purchasing power while they print it up to pay for various social programs, the military-industrial complex, surveillance, and the next one, which is number 2, federal gun control. Now, of course, the founding generation, the old revolutionaries, considered the right of self-defense either a primary or the first law of nature, depending on who you talk to. And I know there's people always give us feedback about that, but just citing them, whether it's James Wilson, Mercy Otis Warren, or many others, they talked about the right of self-defense as the first law of nature or a primary law of nature. And that's part of why they delegated absolutely no power, none whatsoever in the Constitution, to restrict the right to keep and bear arms. None. Zero. And that's what we see if you're watching the video here. Zero, the number of federal gun control laws that are constitutional. But unfortunately, even some of the people who supposedly are in our camp, more friendly or most friendly to our rights, to the right to keep and bear arms, they have absolute blinders on when it comes to federal gun control. It's as if all that stuff, 1934, 1968, 1986, 1988, 2018, it's only bad if it's the current guy doing it. It's only bad. It's only a problem once they see. That's the problem with precedent, especially like with the National Firearms Act. Efforts to actually get rid of that. Once in a while, you'll hear about someone in Congress filing a bill to repeal it. It's never going anywhere because once it's been established as, well, just don't take my guns. I don't have those. I can't afford to get the ones under the NFA, so I don't have those. So, well, it's not affecting me. And if you raise people from cradle to grave thinking that this kind of box around their rights is all they get, and they shouldn't even think about something further than that because they got to pay a huge tax on it, or there's so many restrictions on owning it, suppressors, etc., that, well, they're not even thinking of that as their rights. So you keep reducing the scope of people's rights. That's what their basis is. And then this precedent gets established, those talons stick in you forever. It's hard to get rid of it once it's been established for so many decades. And when it comes to federal gun control, we're talking about almost 100 years of this stuff. So there's plenty of this stuff on the books that never should have existed. And there's been almost there's no vigorous opposition to it. In general, the opposition has been, well, maybe we'll try to get a piece of legislation filed, or we'll support some candidate, or we're going to file a lawsuit here and there. But none of them ever actually work, and therefore more decades keep going, and then we keep getting more and more and more, because human nature and the nature of government power is it's not going to get less unless you resist it, unless you nullify it. It's going to keep adding more and more and more. And I did an episode on this last fall, Second Amendment obliterated, because a lot of people are talking about the new stuff that's coming. And of course, it's all horrible. And they say, oh, well, if we let them get away with this, the Second Amendment's gonna be obliterated. I would make the case that the Second Amendment was obliterated in 1934. As soon as you give them that single step beyond the limits of the Constitution, beyond the limits of the Second Amendment, you've given them a boundless field of power. And here's how I put it for the overview. Even just a quick look at the long and growing list of federal gun control on the books makes it clear to any Constitution supporter that the Second Amendment isn't just newly under attack, it hasn't been in force for close to a century. So number 1, the national bank, the money printer. Number 2, the guns. And for those of you who say that the Second Amendment's in force, it is not. It is definitely wounded. And unless people really start taking a strong response to it, like, of course, we see people in Missouri, Kentucky, Montana, Arizona, and hopefully elsewhere resisting this on a state-by-state level, it's not going to turn around. But we're starting to see some cracks moving forward on that. But it's a huge warning. So number 2 is the right to keep and bear arms. And number 3, I think it's perfect for the time, but taxation. And by allowing internal taxes, which the founders absolutely despised, especially in conjunction with a national bank that's turned into a printing press, plus almost a century of gun control on the federal level at least. Well, here's how John Taylor put it. taxation is not liberty. And of course, if you listen to my episode covering the Treasury secretaries, comparing Yellen and Gallatin, I gave some highlights of how she was talking about, in modern times, the IRS, the taxation system, as being the foundation of our society. Of course it is. It's the foundation of the largest government in history. Well, it's one of the main pillars of it. So it is. She is correct. But it is totally contrary to the ideas of liberty. Taxation, I know we hear the phrase taxation is theft, but I think John Taylor of Caroline was pretty good here. Taxation is not liberty. And with all this, the national bank, the gun control, the tax scheme, we'll put it that way. So we have this largest government in history that keeps growing and growing and growing. And although we're seeing more and more resistance, well, we're running into some problems if we don't turn this around. It's going to require the people to take a stand. As Samuel Adams put it, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. Or Thomas Paine said, those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigues of supporting it. It's not going to be quick. It's not going to be easy. But this is the kind of information we're getting out to people more and more every single day. Sometimes it's not awesome news. Sometimes it is some good news. For example, I covered the win by the states in the Second Amendment Financial Privacy Act just recently, and that's been getting a lot of reach, a lot more than normal. And so that's positive. Sometimes we have some negative stuff, like let's face facts. We live under the biggest government ever, and it's getting worse. And doing the things that people have been doing is going to continue making it worse. So let's shift our focus to state, local, and individual nullification efforts, resistance, and taking a stand for our liberty, whether the government likes it or not. And that's what we do with our membership program. You can support us in that effort for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And while I'm mentioning that, just a quick and a huge thank you to a handful of people who have joined us as members recently. I really appreciate it. I'm not getting everybody, but thank you so much goes out to Donna in Washington State, Everett in Texas, Timothy in Kansas, James in Michigan, and Julie in Indiana. Thank you all so much. I really, really appreciate it. Let me see if I can take a minute or so and take a look over at some comments or questions here. Joseph Bonamolo said, definitely not liberty. That certainly is what we're talking about when it comes to taxation. Taxation, you can call it theft, you can call it tyranny, whatever you want to call it. John Taylor was right. It's definitely not liberty. Kirk Morrison says, let's get back to the Articles of Confederation. I like covering the articles. I've done a number of episodes on it. But I think any strategy that requires a kind of a consensus of a large portion of the country right now, especially when the vast majority of the people absolutely despise liberty, is interesting in theory. Like, we could have that discussion. Is that better or worse? Patrick Henry certainly loved it. He preferred, well, he didn't say love it, but he certainly preferred things that most people complained about, like the requisition system. He thought the requisition tax system was something that would keep government in check. And although it didn't make it more efficient, he thought that was positive. And maybe there's something to that. But I think really the strategy that has to be focused on today is how to do the most that we can as individuals and connect with like-minded individuals to build a stronger bond, whether it comes, not just friendship bonds, but kind of a barrier to attacks on our liberty. So whether you're working in your community or you're working on your state level to reject, resist, and nullify the central state, I think that's the positive step forward. And as people can learn that the world doesn't come to an end when you have more freedom in one area, let's say it's South Carolina or Missouri, well, not too often here in California, but when that happens, when the world doesn't come to an end, then other people who are a little bit more timid will certainly have a chance to get on board. Joseph also says it's theft. That's a good one on taxation. Let's see what else I can get back to. Kirk also says bring back a hard currency and do away with all gun control. Hard currency, absolutely. And I just did the episode on the Legal Tender Act last Friday, talking about how a number of states, we're talking about Utah, Oklahoma, and Wyoming, have gold and silver legal tender acts on the books. In Arkansas, there's a similar piece of legislation to treat gold and silver specie as a payment as money rather than just an investment vehicle. That's on the governor's desk. I'm not sure if it's been signed yet, but I have to keep track of that sometime today. But the more that we see that happen on a state level, the more that the people will be willing to use it. So, for example, I covered in that episode how the Specie Legal Tender Act passed in Utah in 2011 led to the creation of some businesses around that model. And in 2018 or 2019, the Goldback was created. And now somewhere between 20 and 50% of small businesses in Utah accept the Goldback, whereas 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 0% were accepting gold and silver. So we see how one step leads to another. Like Dickinson told us, small things grow great by concord. And that's a very important part of it, because as long as people are using real money rather than fiat, whether paper or digital, that will keep government in check more than maybe most anything else. Anyways, I will look a little bit more at the chat later on today and see if there's any other comments or questions I can get back to. You can also email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you consider our membership program over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I hope this was interesting. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.